So it's 2025, and I wanted to do a little comparison between the Nintendo 3DS and the Nintendo Switch and kind of see what the main differences were to see which one is the better one for you. Now, I will tell you between these two, clearly the Switch is the better one here, but the 3DS, there's not really that much overlap between these two consoles. And I think that's the biggest thing to keep in mind. With the Nintendo 3DS, when looking at this particular device, you have to remember that these two have different games, a different ecosystem. And yes, there might be some overlap here, like there might be some content that's interchangeable. For the most part, these two consoles are very different. And if you have a Switch, that doesn't necessarily mean you've played really any games on the 3DS and vice versa, which is really, really cool. Now, number one, the Nintendo 3DS came out back in 2011. So, with this particular console, you have to remember that this is one of those devices that was superseding, basically being the successor to the Nintendo DS. So, this was dual screens, the top screen was bigger than the bottom screen. The biggest, takeaway with the 3DS, some big improvements here than the previous generation. Number one, the top screen was bigger. You're also getting your front and back camera, which was the same as the DSi, but you were now getting this joystick. This was different than what we were getting the previous generation because between both, this one is clearly a little bit of a different experience. The top screen on the first one was 3.53 inches, the bottom was 2.02 inches, but now with the addition of this joystick, it really added a lot more capability. Now, the joystick is there on the Switch, but this one was a lot. Honestly, I think this one was more superior, way less joystick drift on this one too. You had the buttons. This, I was never a fan of these buttons on the bottom, but they did end up fixing it. The headphone jack was in the center, and then on the top, you're basically getting your charging port. Now, the biggest takeaway, the biggest feature for the 3DS was that 3D toggle. So that was something that was very, very cool, kind of funny. They threw it on here, and I do think at the end of the day, it was a nice thing. But then we switch over to the Nintendo Switch, no pun intended. This one came out about 6 years after the Nintendo 3DS. So this one, and this is the OLED Switch, which came out in 2021, I just think it looks a lot nicer. But with the original one, it came out in 2017. And within that particular console, you were getting, depending on which one, you were getting a smaller display or a 6.2-inch model, if you were getting the LCD panel or the 7-inch one on the OLED. The Switch Lite also came out. This one was a little bit smaller. I think this one came out in 2019. I still love this one, but the OLED Switch is my favorite. Now, the biggest takeaway, the biggest improvements here, they now went over with one display. You had the interchangeable Joy-Cons you can basically remove, so there was that. You were still getting the USB Type-C port on the bottom, so that was a big improvement. And then kind of looking around, game card, kick-out desk thing at the bottom, it was a really cool console, it was a really cool concept. But when you kind of take a look at both of these side by side, you can see they're clearly different. The display on the OLED Switch is so much better than both displays on the Nintendo 3DS. So that right there is a very, very big thing. But like I said, these two are very, very different consoles. They don't really share that much of a library. Now, the Switch is way more powerful and everything like that. I've heard stories that the Nintendo 3DS was about as powerful as something like a GameCube. I think that might be an overstatement, but there might be some overlap there. I think that's, from what I remember, that's kind of what the case was there. So that was kind of a pretty insane thing there. With this one, I really, really like the layout of this, of this display. I really thought that the way this particular console looked, it looked really cool. And that was something that was really nice because it was like this dual screen type of experience. Now, I just have to hit on the gaming library because the library behind this console is insane. There are so many games that are, compatible with this particular console. Now, number one, the thing you have to remember is that the Nintendo 3DS was backwards compatible with all those Nintendo DS games. So all those games you were playing on your Nintendo DS, that was basically here on this particular console. So that right there in and of itself was a very cool thing. You had a bunch of, Super Mario games that came out for this thing. You had all those, there were just endless amounts of games that were available on this thing. And I think at the end of the day, that is one of the biggest takeaways for this type of console. But there was really an endless amount of games that you could play on this type of console. And I think that was a really cool thing going on here. Now, on top of that, I think another one of those things to keep in mind here, and I'm sorry, this was not the DS one, this is the standard, this is the other one, the New Super Mario Bros. 2, I keep getting those two confused because they all look the same. You had Legend of Zelda: Link Between Worlds on this console as well. The graphics of these games were also pretty decent. Again, the displays were pretty low resolution. It's also hard to game while actually talking at the same time. But this was without a doubt a really good looking console with a bunch of capability. And I love the way that you could also click on the home button and still go back home to. That might seem like such a small thing, but back then, whereas on my Nintendo DS, it was just like once you click home, you're basically having to go back home. I think with the DS, you couldn't even go home until you powered down the console. The DSi improved it a little bit, but that was something that was really cool. So, like I said, there's not really that much overlap here in terms of the gaming library because they're very different games. The Switch, which, like I said before, was pretty much the direct successor to the Wii U. So, the Switch has a lot more games kind of available for it that are relatable to the Wii U, just like how the DS had a bunch of games with the DS. But these two consoles were very, very different. Now, the thing that I really loved about my Nintendo Switch was that there was really so much capability behind it. Not only was this thing, graphically really good for the time, even now the games look really good, even though it's very low hardware, like it's not the best hardware of all time. This type of console still looks very good for the most part too. I think the biggest, best thing that the Nintendo Switch has going for it is the ability to dock it. With the 3DS, you were never able to dock it to a different display. You could just always keep it as a standard 3DS. Whereas with the Nintendo Switch, this is a console meant to basically be docked and you can kind of mess around with it from that particular side. So I always thought that was another really cool thing going on for this console too, because you could basically just go through, dock it up to a display, and basically use this as its own dedicated console, connected to your TV, screen, monitor, whatever it was. So that right there was another really cool thing going on for this console too, and I do think that in and of itself makes this that great of a console. Not only that, but there are endless amounts of games available for your Switch too. So there's a lot of games that got ported over from, the Nintendo Wii U. We had Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild that came out for this thing, New Super Mario U Deluxe. The first main title Mario we got for this thing was basically like, Super Mario Odyssey. And that game visually looks beautiful on this type of console. And that is something that I love about the Nintendo Switch is the graphical capability. But there's some controversy between both these consoles because neither one of them are like perfect. I would say with the Nintendo 3DS, the biggest issue that I have with it might be a couple of things. One, the community behind this, although it's really, huge, today there's not a lot of like multiplayer, like online multiplayer games that are available for the 3DS. There might be a few, but there's not really as big of a community as there is now on the Switch because obviously this is an older console. And number two, the displays definitely don't look the best compared to the OLED Switch. This one looks the OLED Switch looks so much better than this one. And number three, the 3D toggle really isn't that big of a deal for me. It's really kind of whatever. I usually almost always keep mine off, and I prefer it off than rather having it on because it doesn't really look that good on camera. But when it's off, it looks so much better. The Switch's main controversy, in my opinion, was two of them. One, it was said to be underpowered when it first came out, and I would say for the most part, if you're going to go through and use this as like your main dedicated console, I could totally see why a lot of people would assume this is underpowered, especially compared to the competition. But number two, this particular console, these joysticks end up drifting all the time. Now, luckily for us, we can go and change them out and go buy new ones if we want to. But that is still a very annoying thing to kind of deal with, to have these Joy-Cons constantly like not working or having issues or those types of things. So that in and of itself can be kind of an annoying thing. But overall, in my opinion, I think in 2025, it could make a lot of sense to go ahead and own both of these. To go ahead and own something like to own something like a Nintendo 3DS, and to also own something like a, Nintendo Switch. I think both these consoles are very, very good, and you can own both, right? There's a lot of reasoning why you should own both and why you can own both. So if you can afford it, I think having Nintendo 3DS in tandem with something like a Nintendo Switch would make a lot of sense. They're very, very good consoles. And I would say at the end of the day, it does make a lot of sense to go and buy them, in my personal opinion. So from that side, that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.